On July 31, 2025, inside Florida's death chamber, Edward J. Zakrzewski II, a former U.S. Air Force technical sergeant, was executed by lethal injection. 31 years earlier, he had murdered his wife and 2 young children in one of the most brutal ways imaginable, using a crowbar, a rope, and a machete. This case shocked America not only for its sheer brutality, but because the killer was once a respected serviceman, a father, and a husband. For nearly 3 decades on death row, Zakrzewski showed no remorse, and his final words, moments before death, sent chills through everyone in the room. Edward J. Zakrzewski II, his life, his crimes, his last meal, and his final statement. From a disciplined military career to a cold-blooded family killer, and the long road that led to his execution. Background and family life. Edward J. Zakrzewski II was born on January 31, 1965. By all outward appearances, his life followed the path of discipline and service. He rose to the rank of technical sergeant in the U.S. Air Force, a position that carried responsibility, respect, and stability. His military career saw him stationed in various locations, including an extended period in South Korea, where his life would change forever. It met Sylvia, whose birth name was Impun. She was bright, spirited, and carried with her the traditions and grace of her Korean upbringing. The two married around 1986, and soon after, they welcomed their first child, Edward III. A few years later, their daughter Anna was born, and the Zakrzewski family appeared to be living the American dream: steady income, 2 children, and a life that seemed well within the boundaries of normalcy. From 1989 to 1992, the family remained in South Korea due to Edward's military assignment. But in the early 1990s, a transfer to Eglin Air Force Base brought them to Mary Esther, Florida. It was a small, quiet town along the Gulf Coast, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names and children could play outside without fear. But beneath the surface of that seemingly perfect life, tension was growing. Friends and family would later recall moments of strained arguments, disagreements, and Sylvia's growing unhappiness. At some point, Sylvia made a life-changing decision. She wanted a divorce. Not only that, she planned to take the children back to South Korea. For Edward, this wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was, in his mind, the complete dismantling of the life he had built. His career, his family, his sense of control, everything felt as though it was slipping away, and on a fateful day reached a boiling point. It was the first week of June 1994 when the tension inside the Zakrzewski household finally boiled over. That morning, while Edward was at home, his 7-year-old son, Edward III, innocently delivered a message that would push his father over the edge. His mother, Sylvia, was planning to divorce him, not only that she was taking both children back to South Korea. For Edward Zakrzewski II, a man who had built his identity around control, duty, and the image of a stable family, the news was devastating. In his mind, it wasn't just a breakup. It was the destruction of everything he thought belonged to him. During his lunch break from work, Edward stopped at a local store and bought a machete. He returned home that afternoon and, in a chilling display of premeditation, hid the machete, a crowbar, and a rope inside the bathroom. He waited. When Sylvia came home later that day, what happened next was a calculated sequence of violence. Edward attacked her with the crowbar, delivering multiple blows to her head. When she was down but still breathing, he looped the rope around her neck and strangled her until she went limp. But the horror didn't end there. He called for Edward III to come to the bathroom, pretending there was something he needed help with. When his young son stepped inside, Edward raised the machete and struck him repeatedly. Moments later, he did the same to his 5-year-old daughter, Anna. Both children bore defensive wounds, small hands that had tried desperately to push the blade away. Sylvia, still alive after the initial attack, was dragged into the bathroom where Edward struck her again with the machete. The brutality of the scene was staggering. It wasn't a crime of sudden rage, it was organized, deliberate. When the murders were complete, Edward didn't call police. He didn't alert a neighbor. Instead, he cleaned himself up, gathered some belongings, and disappeared. By the time the bodies were discovered, Zakrzewski was already on a plane to Hawaii. Under the alias Michael Green, he blended into a religious commune and lived there quietly for months. But his face eventually appeared on Unsolved Mysteries, and it wasn't long before someone recognized him. Faced with exposure, Edward turned himself in, but the truth of what happened inside that house on June 9, 1994, was only beginning to surface. Trial, conviction, and appeals. In 1996, Edward J. Zakrzewski II stood trial for the murders of his wife and children. The prosecution laid out the evidence in chilling detail. The pre-purchased machete, the rope, the calculated sequence of attacks. It was a textbook case of premeditated murder. Witnesses described a man whose military discipline masked a deep undercurrent of control and possessiveness. The state argued that the killings were not a sudden eruption of anger, but the result of deliberate planning. The jury didn't take long. Zakrzewski was found guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. For killing his son and wife, he was initially given life sentences. But for the murder of his young daughter, Anna, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty, a recommendation the judge later expanded by overriding the jury to add death sentences for the other 2 murders as well. From that moment, Edward entered the long, slow grind of Florida's death row. For nearly 3 decades, he fought to overturn his sentence. In 1998, the Florida Supreme Court upheld the verdict. In 1999, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his case. Further appeals in 2003, 2006, and 2009 all ended in failure. By 2016, every state and federal appeal had been exhausted. Still, Edward remained alive due to the slow pace of executions in Florida. That changed in 2025 when Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant, scheduling the execution for July 31. His lawyers filed last-minute appeals, including pleas to the Florida Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court, but both courts declined to intervene. Time had run out. For the families of Sylvia, Edward III, and Anna, the end was finally in sight. But for Edward Zakrzewski, the clock was now counting down to his final hours. Final hours, last meal, and last words. On the morning of July 31, 2025, Edward J. Zakrzewski II awoke for the last time inside his small death row cell at Florida State Prison. At 5:15 a.m., guards roused him, beginning the rigid schedule that marks the end for every condemned prisoner. He had spent nearly 30 years in this place, but this day would not end like the others. Florida's death chamber awaited him. The state had scheduled his execution for 6 p.m., but before that, he was offered one final ritual, his last meal. Zakrzewski made a simple but telling choice: fried pork chops, a cold root beer, and a serving of ice cream. He ate quietly, slowly, as if prolonging the only remaining piece of normalcy he would ever know. As the afternoon drew on, the small group of official witnesses arrived. Journalists, prison staff, and a handful of people representing the victims' families. At 5:45 p.m., guards entered Zakrzewski's cell and escorted him to the chamber. He wore a standard prison uniform, his hands and feet restrained. Once strapped to the gurney, the warden asked him if he had any final words. Zakrzewski spoke in a calm, measured tone. "I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold, calculated, clean, humane, efficient way possible. I have no complaint." It was an oddly detached statement, part sarcasm, part acceptance. There was no apology to the families of Sylvia, Edward III, or Anna, no hint of remorse. At precisely 6:12 p.m., the lethal injection process began. Zakrzewski's breathing slowed, his eyes closed, and within minutes, he was still. At 6:20 p.m., the prison doctor pronounced him dead. For Florida, it marked the 9th execution in a single year, a modern-era record. For the victims' families, it marked the end of a very long wait. Reflection and legacy. The case of Edward J. Zakrzewski II is one that still provokes strong reactions. Here was a man who had sworn an oath to serve his country, who had a stable career and a family, and yet, when faced with the collapse of his marriage, turned to calculated, extreme violence. The brutality of the murders, especially the killing of 2 young children, left little room for public sympathy. But over the years, the case also fueled debates about the death penalty, mental health, and the nature of justice. Precarious, the execution was part of a larger pattern, an unprecedented pace of carrying out capital punishment in 2025. Supporters of the death penalty saw it as overdue justice. Critics viewed it as a troubling acceleration of a flawed system. What is clear is that the murders of Sylvia, Edward III, and Anna shattered more than one family. The loss rippled outward to relatives, friends, and even the military community that had once respected Zakrzewski. 3 decades later, their names are often overshadowed by the notoriety of the man who killed them. But in the end, his life ended in the same sterile chamber that has claimed so many others on Florida's death row. A decorated serviceman, a fractured marriage, 3 lives cut short in the most violent way possible, and a state determined to see the sentence through, no matter how many years it took. The story of Edward J. Zakrzewski II leaves us with one unavoidable question. Was justice served? Did the execution truly bring closure to those left behind? Or is closure even possible in a case like this? I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the death penalty was the right outcome here? Or do you think decades on death row already served as its own form of punishment? Share your opinion in the comments below, and if you want more in-depth true crime stories like this one, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications.